The Galactic Council chambers were, by any reasonable standard, absolutely ridiculous. Picture the United Nations building, but designed by someone who clearly had too much time and an unhealthy obsession with geometric shapes that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. Floating platforms arranged in a perfect circle, each one occupied by a representative of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations, all of them currently engaged in the time-honored tradition of talking about humanity like they weren't sitting right there. Commander Jake Tank Morrison sat in what could generously be called a chair, if chairs were designed by aliens who had only heard chairs described by someone who had never actually seen one. His platform was notably smaller than the others, because apparently size mattered in galactic politics, and humans were still considered the cosmic equivalent of that friend who shows up to the party uninvited but brings really good snacks. As I was saying, Ambassador Quill preened, literally preened because he was a bird-like creature whose species had apparently never heard of humility. The humans are certainly entertaining. But membership in the Galactic Council requires a certain level of sophistication that I'm afraid these charming primitives simply haven't achieved. Jake resisted the urge to mention that humans had figured out faster-than-light travel, while Quill's people were still trying to convince everyone that laying eggs in public was high art. Captain Vex, a reptilian whose scales seemed to shift color based on his mood, which was currently set to condescending green, nodded his massive head. Their military capabilities are particularly concerning. They still use projectile weapons. Kinetic energy. How delightfully archaic. Now, Chairman Blobert interjected, his gelatinous form wobbling in what Jake had learned was the alien equivalent of a diplomatic smile. The humans have shown remarkable progress. They've only been in space for a few decades, and they've already managed to avoid completely destroying themselves. That's actually quite impressive for a species with their temperament. Jake wondered if temperament was the diplomatic way of saying disturbingly violent history, but decided to keep that observation to himself. For now. The debate continued for another hour, with various council members chiming in about humanity's quaint customs, amusing territorial disputes, and adorable tendency to name their spaceships things like the Bodie McBoatface and this end up. They discussed humans like they were a particularly clever species of houseplant that had somehow learned to operate starships. Perhaps, Ambassador Quill suggested with the kind of smile that would make a shark nervous, we should simply observe them for another century or two. You know, make sure they're really ready for the responsibilities that come with galactic citizenship. Jake finally spoke up. With all due respect, Ambassador, I think you might be underestimating us just a tiny bit. The chamber fell silent. Not because Jake had said something particularly profound, but because the aliens were genuinely surprised that the human had opinions about his own species' capabilities. Oh my, Quill chuckled. It has thoughts. How delightful. Ambassador Quill's condescending chuckle echoed through the chamber like the sound of fingernails on a chalkboard. If chalkboards were made of crystallized arrogance and fingernails were made of pure, concentrated smugness. You know what, Quill announced, spreading his wings in a gesture that somehow managed to be both dramatic and pretentious. I think we've entertained this charade long enough. If the humans truly believe they deserve membership in our council, perhaps they should demonstrate their capabilities. Captain Vex's scales shifted to what Jake was beginning to recognize as interested yellow. A demonstration? What did you have in mind, Ambassador? Well, Quill preened, we do have the combat simulator. Standard council protocol for military assessment. Nothing too challenging, of course. We wouldn't want to overwhelm our guest. Jake felt a familiar tingling sensation in the back of his skull. It was the same feeling he'd gotten right before his drill sergeant had volunteered him for advanced combat training, and right before his commanding officer had suggested he might enjoy a tour of duty in the galaxy's most diplomatically sensitive regions. Now, Ambassador, Chairman Blobert wobbled nervously, perhaps that's not entirely necessary. The human seems perfectly pleasant. Very docile. Oh, I insist. Quill's eyes gleamed with the kind of malicious glee usually reserved for tax auditors and people who spoil movie endings. It would be educational. For all of us. The other council members began to murmur among themselves. The crystalline representative, a being that looked like someone had taught a chandelier to be disappointed in everyone, chimed in with a voice like breaking glass. It would settle the question of human capabilities once and for all. Captain Vex was practically vibrating with anticipation, his scales now cycling through what appeared to be the reptilian equivalent of Christmas morning. I could design the scenarios myself. Nothing too dangerous, of course. Just a few standard combat situations. Basic stuff. Jake sighed. He'd tried to warn them. Well, not really, but he'd thought about trying to warn them, which should count for something in the cosmic scheme of things. If that's what it takes, Jake said, standing up from his ridiculous excuse for a chair, then let's get this over with. The aliens exchanged glances that clearly said, did the pet just agree to perform tricks? Quill was practically radiating satisfaction, like a cat that had just convinced a mouse to season itself. Excellent, Quill exclaimed. Captain Vex, please prepare the combat simulator. Nothing too advanced, mind you. We don't want to completely traumatize the poor creature. As they made their way to the simulation chamber, Jake could hear the various council members placing bets behind him. The odds, from what he could gather, were not in humanity's favor. The crystalline delegate had apparently wagered that Jake would surrender within 30 seconds. The gas cloud representative from the nebula systems had bet that Jake would cry. The combat simulator turned out to be exactly what Jake expected, a room full of holographic projectors and enough computing power to simulate entire star systems, all controlled by aliens who thought humans were basically violent teddy bears with opposable thumbs. Now then, Captain Vex said, his claws dancing over the control interface with disturbing enthusiasm, let's start with something simple. Basic hostile encounter. One opponent, standard energy weapons, should be manageable for someone of your limitations. Jake rolled his shoulders and checked his gear. Standard council-issue protection suit, energy sidearm, and a growing suspicion that he was about to make some very powerful aliens very uncomfortable. Whenever you're ready, he said. Captain Vex's scales turned a pleased shade of orange. Oh, we're going to have such fun. The first holographic enemy materialized in front of Jake with all the dramatic flair of a budget science fiction movie. It was humanoid, roughly 8 feet tall, and wielding an energy rifle that hummed with the kind of ominous menace that suggested it could probably vaporize a small building. Jake looked at it. The hologram looked back. The assembled council members leaned forward in anticipation. Then Jake did something that absolutely baffled every alien in the room. He stumbled. Not gracefully, not strategically. He actually tripped over his own feet, rolled clumsily behind a conveniently placed barrier, and came up firing his energy sidearm with what could charitably be described as enthusiastic inaccuracy. "Oh my," Ambassador Quill whispered, not even bothering to hide his delight. "This is even better than I hoped." The holographic enemy advanced, firing precisely aimed shots that Jake barely managed to avoid by throwing himself around the simulation chamber like a caffeinated pinball. His return fire went wide, scorching the walls and generally making the kind of light show that would have been impressive at a rave but was considerably less effective in actual combat. Notice the inefficient movement patterns. Captain Vex provided commentary like he was narrating a nature documentary about particularly clumsy prey animals. Humans clearly lack the spatial awareness necessary for modern combat situations. Jake accidentally fired 3 shots that bracketed the enemy's position without actually hitting it, then dove behind another barrier with all the grace of a sack of wet cement. The crystalline delegate chimed in with obvious satisfaction. Observe how the human's emotional responses interfere with tactical decision-making. Quite primitive, really. Meanwhile, Jake was having what could only be described as a philosophical moment. Here he was, trained by some of the finest military instructors in human space, veteran of 17 different conflicts, holder of more commendations than he could easily count, and he was currently pretending to be the galactic equivalent of comic relief. The irony was not lost on him. The first scenario ended with Jake barely managing to defeat his opponent through what appeared to be sheer dumb luck and the kind of persistence usually associated with particularly determined house pets. The council members exchanged knowing looks that clearly said exactly what we expected. "Shall we increase the difficulty?" Captain Vex asked, his scales now a self-satisfied shade of purple. "Oh, please do," Quill encouraged. "I'm finding this absolutely fascinating from an anthropological perspective." The second scenario featured 3 opponents and environmental hazards. Jake continued his performance as the galaxy's most entertainingly incompetent warrior, stumbling through laser grids accidentally, triggering explosive devices, and generally behaving like someone who had learned combat tactics from action movies and hadn't paid very close attention. But Chairman Blobert, despite his gelatinous appearance and generally peaceful demeanor, had not become leader of the Galactic Council by being completely oblivious to subtle details. And there was something about Jake's clumsiness that didn't quite add up. Like the way he always seemed to stumble in exactly the right direction to avoid fatal damage, or how his wild shots consistently created tactical advantages, or the fact that despite appearing to barely survive each encounter, he was technically winning. "Fascinating," Blobert murmured to himself, his form rippling with what might have been concern. The third scenario was even more complex, 5 opponents, shifting terrain, and weapons that adapted to Jake's tactics. Jake responded by cranking his bumbling human, performance up to 11, complete with what appeared to be panic-induced decision-making and the kind of survival instincts usually associated with particularly lucky rodents. By this point, the other council members were openly laughing. Not with Jake, but at him, which was exactly what he'd been counting on. "I think," Ambassador Quill announced between chuckles, "we can conclude this demonstration. The human has certainly exceeded my expectations for entertainment value." Captain Vex was already preparing what he clearly intended to be the final scenario, his scales cycling through colors that suggested he was having far too much fun. "Just one more test," he said. "Something appropriately dramatic to end on." Jake nodded agreeably, checking his gear and trying very hard not to smile. Because the thing about humans that the aliens hadn't quite figured out yet was that they were very, very good at playing games. Especially games where the stakes were higher than anyone realized. Captain Vex's final scenario materialized with the kind of dramatic flair that suggested he'd been saving his best work for last. The simulation chamber transformed into a gladiatorial arena, complete with roaring crowd sounds and atmospheric effects that would have made a Hollywood director weep with envy. And then the champion appeared. It was 12 feet of muscle, armor, and barely contained violence, wielding a plasma blade that hummed with enough energy to cut through a starship hull. The kind of opponent that had probably been designed to test the absolute limits of Council military capabilities, not to provide entertainment at the expense of a supposedly primitive human. "Oh," Jake said quietly, "you really shouldn't have done that." But his words were lost in Ambassador Quill's delighted exclamation. "Now this should be properly educational. Captain Vex, you've outdone yourself." The holographic warrior didn't waste time with dramatic posturing. It simply charged, plasma blade raised high, moving with the kind of speed and precision that suggested it had been programmed by someone who took combat very, very seriously. The assembled council members leaned forward, expecting to witness Jake's inevitable and probably messy defeat. Ambassador Quill was practically vibrating with anticipation. Captain Vex's scales had settled into a pleased orange that suggested he was already planning his victory celebration. What they got instead was a masterclass in why humans had become the dominant predator on a planet full of things that were bigger, stronger, and had significantly more teeth. Time seemed to slow as the warrior's plasma blade descended toward Jake's head. In that frozen moment, Every alien in the chamber got their first real look at what a human being actually was when you stripped away the diplomatic pleasantries and social conventions. Jake's left hand moved with a speed that defied every assumption the aliens had made about human reflexes. His fingers closed around the plasma blade's handle, bare skin making contact with energy hot enough to melt steel. But instead of the expected scream of agony, Jake's grip was steady, controlled, and absolutely confident. The warrior's momentum carried it forward, but Jake was already moving, spinning the captured weapon with the kind of fluid expertise that suggested he'd done this sort of thing before. Many times. Probably while people were shooting at him. The plasma blade completed its arc in Jake's hands, separating the holographic warrior's head from its shoulders with surgical precision. The silence in the council chamber was the kind of complete, absolute quiet usually associated with the vacuum of space or the moment right before someone realizes they've made a terrible, terrible mistake. Ambassador Quill's beak fell open. Not metaphorically. Literally. It just dropped, hanging there like a broken hinge while his brain tried to process what he'd just witnessed. Captain Vex's scales had gone through the entire color spectrum twice, and were now settled on something that could only be described as oh no white. Chairman Blobert had stopped wobbling entirely, his gelatinous form frozen in what appeared to be existential terror. Jake calmly deactivated the plasma blade and turned to face the council, but his entire demeanor having shifted from harmless pet human to something that made every survival instinct in the chamber start screaming warnings. So, he said conversationally, as if he hadn't just snatched a weapon out of midair that should have killed him on contact, are we done with the testing phase? The crystalline delegate made a sound like wind chimes having a nervous breakdown. The gas cloud representative from the nebula systems began to slowly back away from the viewing area, despite the fact that Jake was separated from them by multiple layers of security shielding. And Ambassador Quill, who had spent the entire day condescending to Jake about human limitations and primitive capabilities, finally asked the question that was probably going to keep him awake for the next several decades. How did you do that? Jake smiled. It wasn't a particularly pleasant smile. It was the kind of smile that made other predators remember they had somewhere else to be. Do what? He asked. Oh, you mean catch the blade? That's just basic human reflexes. Nothing special. And that, more than anything else, was what made the aliens truly understand fear. Because if catching a plasma blade bare-handed was nothing special for a human, what exactly was special? They were about to find out. Jake set the deactivated plasma blade down with the casual care of someone placing a dinner fork back on the table, and the soft clink it made as it touched the simulator floor might as well have been a gunshot for how it made every alien in the chamber flinch. You know, Jake said, his voice taking on a tone that was somehow both conversational and deeply unsettling. I've been sitting here for the past few hours, listening to you all discuss humanity like we're some kind of cute but harmless species that somehow bumbled our way into space travel. And I have to admit, it's been pretty entertaining. Ambassador Quill's feathers had gone completely flat against his head, which Jake was pretty sure was the avian equivalent of trying to make yourself invisible. The thing is, Jake continued, beginning to pace around the simulation chamber with the casual confidence of a predator in its natural habitat, you've got humanity completely backwards. See, you keep talking about our limitations, our primitive nature, our inefficient designs. But what you're actually describing is the most successful predator species in our planet's history. Captain Vex's scales were now cycling through colors that didn't appear on any known spectrum, which Jake took as a good sign that his point was getting across. Take our bipedalism, for instance. You mentioned how inefficient it is compared to your various forms of locomotion. But do you know what bipedalism actually gives us? Humans can run down prey for days. Literally days. We're persistence hunters. Which means we don't need to be faster than you. We just need to keep coming and coming and coming until you collapse from exhaustion. The crystalline delegate made a sound like someone stepping on bubble wrap filled with anxiety. And our emotions? Those wasteful, inefficient emotional responses you keep mocking? They're not bugs. They're features. Fear makes us faster. Anger makes us stronger. Love makes us willing to die for each other. Humans don't just fight for territory or resources. We fight for ideas. We fight for people we've never met. We fight for principles that exist only in our heads. Jake stopped pacing and looked directly at the assembled council members, and for the first time since he'd entered the chamber, they were paying complete attention to every word he said. "But here's the really fun part," Jake said, his smile becoming increasingly predatory. "Everything you think makes humans primitive actually makes us terrifying. We pack bond with literally anything. Our ships? We name them and treat them like family members. Our weapons? We give them nicknames and talk to them. We've been known to pack bond with our enemies in the middle of firefights." Chairman Blobert's wobbling had intensified to the point where he looked like he was having some kind of gelatinous seizure. "We turned warfare into an art form, then we turned that art form into entertainment, then we turned that entertainment into a way to teach our children tactical thinking. We have entire industries devoted to creating increasingly realistic simulations of combat scenarios, and we call it fun." Captain Vex was making small whimpering sounds that definitely weren't in his species' normal vocal range. "And the absolute best part," Jake said, warming to his theme, "is that we consider all of this perfectly normal. Catching plasma blades? That's just standard military training. Any human soldier worth his salt can do that. It's not even particularly impressive by our standards." Jake gestured toward the deactivated simulator. "You designed those scenarios based on what you thought were overwhelming odds for a primitive species. But for a human? That was Tuesday. We call that kind of thing light exercise or stress relief." The implications were starting to sink in, and Jake could practically see the calculations running behind the alien's eyes. If this was what humans considered basic competency, what were their actual military capabilities? How many human ships were currently in the galaxy? How many humans were there, period? "So here's where we stand," Jake said, his tone becoming almost cheerfully conversational again. "You've spent the day treating humanity like we're some kind of amusing oddity that you might, eventually, allow into your little club. But the reality is that we're a species of persistence predators with pack-bonding instincts, tactical creativity, and emotional responses that override our self-preservation programming." Jake picked up the plasma blade again, activating it with casual expertise. "We're not asking for permission to join the galactic community. We're already here. The question is whether you want us as friends or as something else entirely." The silence stretched for a long moment before Chairman Blobert managed to speak. "Friends," he said quickly. "Definitely friends. We would very much like to be friends." The Council's emergency vote on human membership took approximately 17 seconds, which Jake was pretty sure was some kind of galactic speed record. Chairman Blobert didn't even bother with the usual procedural formalities. He just looked around the chamber, saw nothing but frantically nodding heads and species-appropriate gestures of agreement, and declared the motion carried. "Full membership," Blobert announced, his gelatinous form quivering with what Jake hoped was diplomatic enthusiasm rather than existential terror. "Effective immediately. With all the rights and privileges thereof. And a permanent seat on the Security Council," Ambassador Quill added quickly, his voice pitched slightly higher than usual. "We insist. It would be inappropriate to exclude such a militarily capable species from security decisions." Captain Vex, who had apparently regained some of his composure along with a color that existed in normal space, cleared his throat. "There is, of course, the matter of the standard integration period. Usually new members undergo a probationary phase while we assess their commitment to galactic peace and stability." Jake raised an eyebrow. "And?" "Waived," Captain Vex said immediately. completely waived. We're confident in humanity's commitment to peaceful coexistence. How confident? Jake asked, because he'd learned that when aliens started making concessions this quickly, it was worth finding out exactly how far their newfound respect extended. We'd also like to offer humanity preferred trading status. The crystalline delegate chimed in, their voice still carrying undertones of barely controlled panic, and priority access to Council scientific databases, and perhaps a small token of welcome. Nothing major. Maybe mining rights to a few uninhabited star systems. A dozen or so. A dozen star systems? Jake asked. Per month, Captain Vex clarified quickly. Until you're properly established. We wouldn't want you to feel unwelcome. Jake tried very hard not to laugh. 3 hours ago, these same aliens had been debating whether humans were intelligent enough to understand basic diplomatic protocols. Now they were offering them real estate and begging them not to conquer anyone. That's very generous, Jake said diplomatically. I'm sure humanity will appreciate the gesture of friendship. Chairman Blobert's wobbling intensified with what Jake was beginning to recognize as relief. Excellent. We're so pleased to welcome humanity to the galactic community. Such a peaceful species, very neighborly. We're sure you'll fit right in. Oh, absolutely, Jake agreed. Humans are very social creatures. We love making new friends. The aliens exchanged glances that suggested they weren't entirely sure whether that was reassuring or terrifying. As Jake prepared to leave the chamber, Ambassador Quill approached him with the kind of careful, respectful distance usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. Commander Morrison, Quill said, his voice carefully modulated to avoid any possible hint of condescension. I hope you'll forgive our earlier misunderstandings about human capabilities. We were clearly operating under some misconceptions. No hard feelings, Jake said magnanimously. It happens. First impressions can be misleading. Indeed, Quill nodded frantically. One question, if I may. That technique you used to catch the plasma blade, is that common knowledge among your species? Jake considered the question seriously. Catching plasma blades? Not really. I mean, it's covered in basic military training, but most humans would probably use a shield or just dodge. It's more of a showing-off technique than anything practical. Showing off, Quill repeated faintly. Yeah, you know, like juggling or doing backflips. Impressive but not terribly useful in everyday life. As Jake walked out of the council chambers, he could hear Ambassador Quill's voice behind him. Chairman Blobert, should we perhaps send a general advisory to all council member species about our new human allies? Advisory about what? Blobert's reply was muffled but clearly audible. Well, to warn them that we've just given the galaxy's apex predators access to our military databases, our trade routes, and our home system coordinates. There was a long pause. Quill, Chairman Blobert said finally, I think the word you're looking for isn't warn. It's prey. Jake smiled as he made his way back to his ship, already composing his report to Earth Command. Humanity had just been handed the keys to the galaxy by aliens who were now probably going to spend the next few decades trying to figure out how to avoid accidentally offending their new terrifyingly friendly neighbors. He was humming an old Earth tune as he walked, something cheerful and optimistic about making friends and influencing people. Behind him, the Galactic Council was learning an important lesson about the dangers of judging a species by its diplomatic representatives. Some lessons, Jake reflected, were more expensive than others.